Hello. Oh, that's fun. Um, she was still asleep when I left, so I'm not sure. She had a rough evening last night. I didn't get to sleep until like 4, so I'm not super alert today. Sorry. Mm. Mm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, her molars on the right side, I think, finally cut through the gums. But I think the molars on the left side have started coming through now. So she was pretty cranky last night, and I'm running off of 3 hours of sleep now. So yeah, yeah. Well, I'm still anticipating twins for round 2, so we'll see what happens there. Yeah, I have like 3 different Facebook friends who just all announced either pregnant with twins or just giving birth to twins in the last week. So apparently it's going around. All right. Yeah. All right. Welcome back to our Ruth study. So the goal is to at least finish lesson 5. Um, and if we get into the lesson 6 ones, cool. I'm prepared for that. Aside from the sleep deprivation. Um, so there's 8 lessons in this study, but there's really only questions for 7 of them. So the lesson 8 packet is really just a write up to analyze the questions I will answer on lesson 7. So after we finish the lesson 6 questions, we'll have the lesson 7 questions either next week or the week after, depending on how long stuff takes. Um, and that will essentially be it for the Ruth study. Um, the Augsburg Confession study, we're starting September 11th because that's the first Sunday after Labor Day when we do our big Bible study kickoff breakfast thing. So we will potentially need a 2 to 3 ish week filler. So again, if anyone has like single topic studies you want to hear me rant about for an hour, um, let me know and I'll throw something together. But we just need something short, 2 to 3 ish week to fill in this gap between the end of Ruth and the start of the Augsburg Confession. So keep evangelism. Uh, yeah, I'm just that's one of my weaker areas. I don't really know. Yeah, I don't know how much I can really say about it though. That's the. But yeah, yeah. Well, it's probably going to be 2 to 3 weeks depending on how this goes. But yeah, we can see. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So we left off on question 11 of lesson 5. Um, so again, we're dealing with the trial, the confrontation between Boaz and the unnamed kinsman redeemer about what's going to happen with Elimelech's land. It's just 6 verses. I'll reread our section. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will not, if you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." All right, so question 11 then. Since Naomi and Ruth had no offspring to inherit their land, the unnamed kinsman redeemer felt he had everything to gain and nothing to lose. What pronouncement of Boaz stopped him from completing his transaction in verse 5, and then a cross reference to Deuteronomy 25 that helps explain it as well. So verse 5 is, "And then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Right. So he's making a package deal with Ruth. Probably there's some disagreement on the translation of that passage. So it's depending on how you translate it, either Boaz is saying, if you do redeem the land, you have to take Ruth with it. She's a package deal. Or he's saying, even if you do redeem the land, I am going to be taking Ruth for myself and marrying her. But either way, there's this recognition that Ruth is the widow of the dead that the land belongs to, and an heir is going to be produced from her. And so our cross-reference to Deuteronomy 25 is talking about Levirate marriage. "If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel." So what's happening here, you can show I'm not answering ahead. Again, there's this recognition that within the tribes of Israel, the land belongs to God, but he gives it to the families, and there's this overarching command that the families maintain the land. So when you're selling land in Israel, you're really just leasing out the harvesting rights to the land, but it reverts back to the family if it gets redeemed, or if nothing else, then every 50 years when they get the Jubilee, all the land reverts back to the families. And so the only way you can really permanently acquire land is if you do lease the harvesting rights, or you redeem the land from somebody who has no heir, and then I believe then it can revert back to you if there's no heir to claim it when the Jubilee happens. And that's sort of what the Redeemer here is thinking. Oh yes, I can, there's no heir, I can purchase this land, it will then go on to my family, this will increase the inheritance I can leave for my children. And then Boaz throws this wrench in the works and he says, by the way, Ruth is going to be married off. Again, translation's a little bit wonky. Either you're going to have to marry Ruth or I'm going to marry Ruth, but one way or another, she's getting married. And that means that if Ruth, as the widow of the land's owners, produces an heir, even though it's not with her dead husband, it's with the Redeemer, that heir counts for all inheritance purposes. That son counts as the son of Malon. And so the Redeemer is being told, you can redeem this land and you'll get the harvesting rights for a time, but once Ruth has a son, that son becomes the heir of the land. So you can redeem this land, but it's not going to become a permanent inheritance to go to your family. It will go back to Ruth's son, who will become the family member who inherits it as the heir in the stead of the heir that Mahlon was not able to produce with her. So that's why as soon as Boaz brings it up, the Redeemer changes his mind. I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. So he's redeeming the land so he can have a larger inheritance to give to his heirs, but now he finds out he buys the land. Either he has to marry Ruth and she'll produce an heir that's going to get that chunk of land back, or he redeems the land and then Boaz marries Ruth and they have an heir who gets that chunk of land back. But either way, the Redeemer doesn't get this parcel of land as part of the inheritance he gives to his heirs, and so he doesn't want to mess with any of that, and so now he backs out. Does that all make sense? Yeah, I know. Levirate marriage is weird to talk about because we don't really have a reference for that in our culture. Yeah. Yeah. Um, let's see. Trying to, yeah. Yeah, and this is part of how why we recognize Boaz as being a worthy man as he was initially introduced. Um, in making this declaration before everyone, in the recognition that Ruth's heir will become the inheritor of the land. Boaz is saying, even if the Redeemer backs out and Boaz inherits the land, it's the same thing. This is not going to be part of the inheritance he gives to any of his other children. If he has other children, it's entirely possible he's already married and has a family of his own, which that's a whole can of worms as well. But he's establishing um, his firstborn son with Ruth is going to inherit this parcel of land. It's not going to be part of his package either. And so, on one hand, it is kind of a good business deal because, until the heir is of age and can inherit it, he does have the leasing rights to the land and he can make profit off of it. But he is making a significant sacrifice on himself because, once they have a son who reaches 13 or age of manhood, whatever, I think it's 13, he gets that land now, and all of the profits would be going to him instead of Boaz. So he's making a significant sacrifice himself in order to look out for what's best for Ruth and Naomi, and also to uphold the righteousness of the law. He's recognizing this is how it's supposed to work, even though it's a sacrifice on his end, and he could have not brought up the whole Ruth thing or not recognized, because again, Ruth wasn't counted as an Israelite since she was married outside of Israel. So he could have maybe used that as a loophole and say, oh, her heir isn't going to inherit the land. I'll marry Ruth, but I'm going to inherit the land for me and all of my credit too. So he's making a sacrifice here, again, for the sake of Ruth and Naomi, and also just because it's the law and he's following the law of God as best he can. Mary.
Now, if Ruth would have had a daughter, would she have to keep having children until she had a male?
I believe, yeah. I'm pretty sure the inheritance would go by son. It's possible. Yeah, again, we're getting out of my area of expertise. It's possible if she had a daughter, then the inheritance would become part of her dowry, so that then whoever she married would then be counted as the heir. But don't quote me on that because I'm not sure. This is getting really out into the weeds, where I don't really have much studying there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, usually the firstborn son, um, but still a maybe. I don't quote me on that. I'm not sure. That's just kind of my guess. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah. So if she didn't have a male, then it would just kind of be up for grabs and redemption from some other male who was eligible. But it's still a pretty significant gamble. That's why the unnamed redeemer backs out of it. Right. Yeah. 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 Well, I mean, he's getting a nice chunk of land out of it, so maybe it's not too hard to feed the two extra mouths. But yeah, he's the unnamed redeemer is looking after just his immediate family. Because remember, Ruth is an in-law, but Naomi is his relative in some way. She might be a relative by marriage, but the unnamed redeemer is a relative through Elimelech. That's why he's an eligible redeemer. Um, so Ruth and Naomi are already his family too. We could say he has an obligation, regardless of how the land deal works out. He does have an obligation to look out for them and provide for them as much as he's able. Um, and it seems that he's not doing that. So again, we talked about this last week. You read between the lines in the way that Boaz sets up this confrontation. It's not just a hey, I'm interested in redeeming the land if you're not, so act or get off the pot. But there's also kind of this underlying why haven't you done your duty as a redeemer yet sort of thing. Um, it doesn't say. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Oh, you could. Yeah. So in the Old Testament, yeah, in the Old Testament, polygamy is never outright outlawed. You don't find a verse specifically condemning it. It's certainly not the best practice. Um, again, you read in Genesis, God created the male and female so that the man would leave his household and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. You can find plenty of verses that imply that monogamy is the standard, but you don't really get verses saying, "Hey, monogamy is the way to go" until you get to the New Testament. Um, yeah, Solomon has the 700 wives, 300 concubines, or whatever. Um, so polygamy happens in the Old Testament, and it's not outright condemned. It's every time it happens, it leads to issues one way or another. But you have to again, you have to read between the lines to recognize that polygamy is not super acceptable in the Old Testament, even though it's not outright condemned. So he's not breaking any of the given laws if polygamy happens. And again, with the Levirate marriage, you can kind of end up sort of forced into a polygamy situation because if your brother dies and leaves a widow, you're required to, by the law, you're required to produce an heir with her, which means you have to marry her at least long enough to get an heir produced. And yeah, it gets really messy and weird quick. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it could just be interfering with his home life. If he shows up, it's like, hey, honey, I gotta go sleep with her now. um, yeah. Uh, but yeah, I guess I have to note on this half. While polygamy is not outright condemned in the Old Testament, neither is it outright endorsed. So all the people who are like, oh, you don't really believe in the biblical definition of marriage because you're not okay with polygamy. It's like, it never commands polygamy either, except again, sort of with the Levirate marriage, maybe. That gets wonky. But polygamy as an institution is not endorsed, and again, every time it happens, it usually leads to issues. Yeah. The Levirate marriage is to make sure that there's an heir to keep the family name and continue the land. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But again, when you look at all the other polygamy situations that happen in the Old Testament, they don't end well. Abraham takes Hagar, and that just leads to jealousy between Hagar and Sarah, and enmity between Sarah and Ishmael. I don't think we have any record of Ishmael interacting with Jacob, or with Isaac, but that was probably pretty awkward if they did. But that was outright condemned, because that was Abraham and Sarah trying to go behind God's back and force his hand to make the heir come that was promised outside of God's timing, because that's what happens. There's like, oh, God promised us an heir like 10 years ago, and I'm tired of waiting. Sleep with Hagar, and he'll count. Whatever else we have will count. They're trying to force God's hand, and he's not super happy about that. And that's why even though Ishmael is Abraham's firstborn son, he does not inherit the promise unless you're a Muslim, and then you say that the promise does go to Ishmael. You know, Jacob ends up married to two women because of the duplicity of Laban. So he's married to Leah and Rachel, and it's pretty clear. It was clear the whole time he wanted to marry Rachel. So already Leah has jealousy issues, and then they end up in a competition for who can provide the most sons for Jacob. He ends up with the 12 tribes, and they also each give him their handmaids too. So the 12 tribes come from 4 different women. And there's plenty of sibling rivalry that happens. We see it most clearly with Joseph versus the other 10, but I don't imagine the other 10 always got along either. There's always kind of my mom's legitimate, your mom's just a handmaid sort of thing. Jacob doesn't win Parent of the Year awards because of any of this. Solomon, like we said, he has the 1,000 wives and concubines, and they lead him astray, such that he brings idol worship into Israel, and that's sows the seeds for Israel's exile and conquering by the Assyrians. Yeah. Yeah, the Levirate marriage. Yeah. 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 Again, it's. Mhm. Yeah. So again, you don't get a clear cut declaration monogamy is the way to go until you get into the New Testament with I think it's First Timothy, when Paul is giving the requirements for who should be a pastor, and if a pastor is held to a higher standard, these are the high standards that everyone should be striving towards. But if you're going to be a pastor, you should especially be meeting them. And he says husband of one wife. So that's where monogamy gets clearly stated as the ideal. Everything else you kind of have to infer and read between the lines. And again, it's God created them male and female, so the husband would leave his family and cling to his wife, not leave his family and cling to his wives. There's already this expectation of monogamy there, but it's not spelled outright. And you don't get the outright condemnation of polygamy that we maybe would like to see in the Old Testament. And so it does happen, but it's never commanded by God. You should be polygamous. It's never really endorsed. And again, all the instances we have of polygamy, it causes issues because that's not the design that God has designed creation for. The closest you get to the closest you get to an endorsement of polygamy is during David's reign, because even before the Bathsheba thing, he had multiple wives. He married Michal, the daughter of Saul, and he had at least one other. I think he married Abigail as well, and maybe a third one. Um, and there is a prophet who is like extolling David's greatness, and he says that it's good that David has multiple wives because it was kind of this status symbol and a sign of how rich and well off David was and kind of the political power he accrues through these marriages. Um, but there's no indication that he's speaking for God in that moment. He's probably just he's just kind of outright buttering up David and giving all the praises he can to him. So that's the closest you get to any kind of endorsement of polygamy. And again, it's not a super strong endorsement of polygamy. Um, and again, in the New Testament, you have the outright condemnation of it, especially for church leaders, where Paul says, hey, if you're going to have a church leader, he should be the husband of one wife only, not with multiple wives. And then 1800 years later, Joseph Smith comes along and says, hey, God told me to start the real church and I need 40 wives, until the U.S. government starts cracking down on stuff. And then God will change his mind and say that if you have multiple wives, you're excommunicated. This is a perfectly logical and coherent system. I don't know why anyone would doubt anything that I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And again, if you really you go back to Genesis and look at Leah and Rachel's bickering to each other, and you can see why it's not really a good thing and why it's not part of the design for marriage in the first place. Um, yeah, well, they weren't fighting over him. No, they were because like Jacob doesn't really get mentioned in the fighting. The fighting is I've produced more sons than you. Ha ha ha! I'm better. Um, it was more just status within the household, not so much Jacob's actual feelings towards each other. Because it was clear that Jacob favored Rachel already, and that does make Leah jealous. Because I'm sure it doesn't feel great if you're married to a husband who doesn't love you and loves your sister. That's weird. um, did he get drunk? I noticed she was veiled during the ceremony, so he didn't see her face. But yeah, okay, yeah, um, yeah. Um, but yeah. And Leah conceived and bore a son and called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. And then she bore a son, and so she has 4 sons. And then when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. So it's not so much, oh, we're fighting over Jacob. It's more status within the household and how the rest of society looks at it as like, oh, look, Leah's got children and Rachel doesn't have any. I think we know which one God prefers. Um, yeah, they're not so much fighting over Jacob as they are kind of status. Uh, yeah. Yeah. I was not expecting to spend this much time on polygamy today, but here we go. All right, getting back on track. Question 12. In Bethlehem's recorder of deeds' office, whose name would then remain on the land? Right, so it's going to remain in the name of Elimelech, assuming Ruth has an heir, but again, statistics are as long as she's not barren, she's going to have a son eventually because birth control wasn't a thing, and people had lots of kids back then, so it would it would once Ruth produces an heir, then it goes to the heir's inheritance and remains within that family. And so the record of inheritance would go to Elimelech, to either Mahlon or Chilion. I can't remember which one Ruth was. I think Ruth was married to Chilion, actually. Mahlon, was it Mahlon? But it would go from Elimelech to Mahlon to Ruth's son. It would not go to, there might be an asterisk that the Redeemer owned the land for a little bit, but then it reverts to Ruth's heir, which, again, that's the point. That's why the Redeemer backs out of the deal, because it would not become his family's land in perpetuity. It would become his family's land for like a decade until an heir is produced and comes of age, and then it reverts back to him. And so it doesn't stay in his family line. That's why he backs out. All right, 13 is kind of a weird question, but here we are. Most of us live in houses that we call our own, whose name is included on many such deeds. Yeah, banker, lender, the one who really owns the land or really owns the house, at least until your mortgage is paid off. And again, this is sort of our analogy for how land ownership works in Israel. The people own it, they have their name upon their parcel of land, and it remains in that family. But ultimately, God is the one who owns the land. That's what he says. We'll get to that in 15. But yeah, God is pretty clear when they enter the promised land. This is my country. I'm giving it to you to use as stewards. And the land that I give to you should remain in the family lines, but don't make the mistake of thinking it's your own land. It's my land. I'm giving it to you as a gift because I am your God and you are my people. So just as, I own my house because it's my name on the mortgage, really the bank owns my house because I'm still paying off the bank. And it's that sort of idea. I'm responsible for it. I'm taking care of it. If people try to kick me out and take it, I have legal repercussions I can draw against them to say, no, I have the right to live here, not you. But I don't really own my house for another 28 years until I finish paying off the mortgage. And even then, it belongs to the U.S. government because I'm still going to pay property taxes on it. But that's a whole thing. Does that make sense? Good? All right. 14. This is, I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this question, but the Lord set the rules in place that Boaz quoted. Today, lenders set the conditions for home and property loans. Draw a comparison between the two. Which would you prefer and why? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, God's going to give you a better deal. So you always default to God when you have an option. But yeah, just again, you have a responsibility to the one who actually owns the property. Again, I have a responsibility to make my monthly payments to the bank, or else it is their right to kick me out and sell it for their own good. God owns the promised land that he gives to Israel. He has every right to kick them out if need be. And essentially that's what happens when the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles happen, is Israel gets kicked out because they haven't been keeping up to their responsibilities. But God is a lot more forgiving than the bank. Israel gets a lot more chances to make it up than what I would get if I just stopped making payments to my mortgager. All right. Yeah. Uh, so now 15. Who had given the land to Elimelech, Naomi, and Ruth, which we've talked about multiple times, but this is Joshua 1. This is where God sets this whole thing up. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all the people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. So again, you have this overarching recognition God is giving the land to them. It's God's land. He is gifting to them, but he's still ultimately the owner. I am giving this to you, but he has the right to take it back if need be. And then, as you read through, if you go back to the Torah, when God is establishing all the rules for land ownership, that's where he's established. When I give this land to you, it's remember I'm giving it to you as a steward to watch over it for me, essentially, and that's where he sets up all the rules about it staying within the family and the Jubilee system, where land rights revert back to people so that the land remains in the family. Because again, it's part of this recognition. You don't own the land. You can't acquire more land for yourself. It's ultimately God's land that he's gifting to the whole nation. So even as you purchase some land for yourself, it still ultimately belongs to the nation as a gift from God, and it's going to revert back to the original members of the nation who were given that parcel of land to begin with. It's still making sense. Again, I'm running off of 3 hours of sleep, so I'm more muddled than usual. But yeah, we've talked about, we've answered this question again already. But 16, the unnamed kinsman redeemer changes his mind. What reason does he give for doing so? And again, he doesn't want to impair his own inheritance. He's all gung-ho about getting the land because he thinks he can add it to his inheritance because there doesn't seem to be an heir. But then Boaz makes this point, again, wonky translation, but he's either saying, if you do redeem this land, then you also have a responsibility to give an heir to Ruth, who will be the one to inherit the land. Or he's saying, you can redeem this land, but I'm going to marry Ruth, and whatever son we have will become the inheritor of the land. But either way, the Redeemer does not get this parcel to add onto his inheritance. At best, he gets control of it for 13 years to make what 13-ish years to make what profit he can off of it, but then it's going to revert to whatever heir Ruth produces. He doesn't want to mess with his inheritance. He doesn't want to deal with the legal headache of making sure this land remains separate from that land when it gets passed on. So he backs out of the whole thing. Which leads us to 17 then. In your opinion, would he have been a good kinsman redeemer for Naomi and Ruth? State your reason, or state the reasons for your opinion. Right. So he's looking out for himself and his immediate family, not necessarily Ruth and Naomi's best interest. Because again, remember they're his family too. That's why he's eligible as a redeemer. But as soon as he finds out, however these dealings proceed, it's going to be ultimately for Naomi and Ruth's best interest. He says, I'm going to back out of all of this then because I need to make sure I take care of my own family. So even as he admits that he will redeem the land, in the back of his mind, it's I'll redeem this land so that my sons can have a bigger inheritance, not out of any kind of familial duty to Ruth. And so he's going at this from kind of selfish motivations, looking after his immediate family rather than the extended family that he really does bear responsibilities to. Whereas again, Boaz, as the worthy and righteous man, is willing to make the sacrifice of splitting up the inheritance so that Ruth's heir will get what's due to him. He is being more selfless about the whole thing. He's willing to look out for Ruth and Naomi and do what's best for them, and also the memory of Elimelech and his sons. Makes sense still? Are we good? I'm sorry, I'm very sleepy. 18. Your name may not be listed at your local recorder of deeds' office, but if Jesus is your kinsman redeemer, and again, Boaz is typological for Jesus, which book is your name listed in? Cross-reference to Revelation 20, but once we're talking about books in Revelation, it should be pretty clear what book we're talking about. right, the Book of Life. 2015. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. And then 21:27. Nothing unclean will enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life will be allowed in. So just, again, Boaz being typological for Christ, it makes this whole thing an analogy to help us better understand what it means when Jesus redeems us. Because, again, a redeemer is somebody who purchases back what was lost. It's not someone who just acquires land for himself. It's someone who their family owned land and they lost it one way or another, and he gets it back for them. Um, and so if we look at the whole history of salvation, we start out belonging to God. The fall happens, that's what makes us lost, and we're in ownership of Satan to a certain degree. And then Jesus, through his blood, purchases us back from the power of sin, Satan, and death to return us into God's ownership. So then that's recorded in the book of life. That's the recorder of deeds thing. So just as through Boaz, Elimelech's lineage is preserved, so that in their record books, it's going to show that the land went from Elimelech to Mahlon and Chilion through Ruth's eventual heir, which will be Obed. So that legally, on paper, the land remains in Elimelech's line. When Jesus redeems us, our names get written in the book of life. So by the legal records, we are shown belonging to God, even though we were lost to Satan for a time. Make sense? I know analogies fall apart if we look at them too hard, but there we go. All right. So we have 15 minutes. So let's go ahead and jump into lesson 6 then, and we'll see how far we get. So yeah, we'll obviously not finish lesson 6, so I'm assuming we'll maybe finish lesson 6 next week, now that we're getting a head start on it. Then we'll do lesson 7 the week after that. Let me pull my calendar. So yeah, we'll have 1 or 2 weeks probably between the end of Ruth and the start of the Augsburg Confession, so I'll see what I can do on evangelism. Oof. All right, looking at the next 5 verses then, 7 through 12. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Now also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon," there we go, widow of Mahlon, "I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." All right, question 1. This is where we get to the Leviticus verse I was hoping for earlier. Who was the true owner of the land that both men were seeking? God. And Leviticus 25:23 is where he explains it. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. So that in all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption of the land. This is why the redemption system is there. Again, it belongs to it belongs to God. It's given to the family in perpetuity. You're not allowed to sell it in perpetuity to anyone else. It's supposed to remain within the family. So you can only sell. You lease harvesting rights to the land for up to 50 years, depending on where you are in relation to the Jubilee. But whenever the Jubilee happens, it reverts back to the original family, because that's how God is gifting this land to Israel as a whole, not just to, it's not, okay, you're the first guys in Canaan, so you divide the land and then it's yours to do with whatever you please. It's, I own this land, I'm gifting it to you, but I want to make sure that your descendants are taken care of as well, and so it has to remain within your family lines. You can't sell it in perpetuity. I feel like we've emphasized that enough. All right, question 2 is weird. I think I know where she was going with when she wrote this study, but I think she's reaching a lot. Relate Ecclesiastes 7:19 to the meeting that was taking place at the city of Bethlehem's gates. Ecclesiastes 7:19 says, "Wisdom gives strength to the wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city." Um, I think she's just going for the fact that there's 10 elders here presiding over the case, but I don't think that's like, I feel like she's just drawing a connection of 10 people here and 10 people in Ecclesiastes. But in the Ecclesiastes verse, it's saying it's better to be like one wise man can be better than 10 men if you apply your wisdom rightly. And it's not Boaz versus the 10 elders of the city. They're just there to be witnesses and kind of judge and jury over the whole proceedings. So unless anyone else has another idea where she's going with, I think she's just really, really reaching here and writing this study and just drawing connection that there's 10 men in both cases. But yeah, this does not come with a leader's guide where I'm given the answers that she's looking for in these questions, but that's the only connection I was able to find here. Yeah. Boaz is the wise and godly person, but he's not being pitted against the 10 elders of the city, or yeah, and that's why I think the comparison falls apart. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, that's the implied accusation to the unnamed kinsman redeemer is not just if you will redeem it, redeem it. If not, let me know. But there's that implication of why haven't you redeemed it yet? That's been your duty this whole time. Like we don't know exactly how long Ruth and Naomi have been back, but they've been there long enough that everyone else knows their reputation and knows their stories, and the Redeemer should know that he's related and he's the next in line to redeem the land, so he should have acted on it in one way or another. So yeah, I guess putting the best construction on this question, maybe the elders of the city should have been seeing justice done and confronted the Redeemer, and it takes Boaz to be the one to step up and make this confrontation happen. Mary, thoughts?
It's looking like the elders are like we are in this day and time where they don't want to be bothered.
Yeah.
They don't want to, you don't have to. Forget it. There's other important things. We got to play our video games. They have to sit in the courtyard and watch people go by.
Yeah.
It's not important to them.
Yeah. So I guess the fact that Boaz has to force the confrontation is what we're getting at here. Yeah. Yeah. Right. When the land is being sold, it's again the land is supposed to stay in the family. So if someone has to sell the land for whatever reason, the redeemers should be the first ones to be buying it up. But again, that's assuming they're able to. If they don't have the money to redeem the land, then they don't have the money to redeem the land. So it's not to be a burden on them. So it's entirely possible the unnamed redeemer just, they were in the middle of the famine. He just didn't have the means to buy the land, and so he was able to sell to someone else. But again, this is part of the duty and obligation of the redeemer. As soon as you're financially able to buy the land, you should be buying it back for your family's behalf. So during the whole time that they're away in Moab, if the Redeemer had earned enough that he could have redeemed the land, he should have redeemed it so that by the time Naomi and Ruth come back, they could be like, oh, we have our land now because our Redeemer redeemed it for us while we are away. Thank you, unnamed Redeemer, who we can give a name to now because you're not being shamed forever for your shameful behavior in this whole case. Um, and again, that's sort of what Boaz is saying is when he's confronting him in the court is, why haven't you been fulfilling your obligation? Um, and, if he had just said, I just don't have the money, I would love to redeem the land, but I'm not able to, this would be a different story. But the fact that he immediately steps up, he's like, yeah, I'll redeem the land. That's saying, oh, he's been able to this whole time. So again, the question is, why haven't you? Yeah, I don't have a good segue away from that. Sorry. All right. Question 3 then, unless we have more on 2. Describe the details involved in the transfer of property at this time in Israel. Cross-reference to Deuteronomy 25. So 25, 5 through 10 says, again, this is the Levirate marriage thing. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name shall not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him, and if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face, and she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal pulled off.
Well, this doesn't apply to Ruth because his brother is dead also. Ruth could not go to her brother-in-law.
Right.
Because he was also dead.
Right.
So this didn't really apply to her. It goes a step further.
Right. So we're not directly in the Levirate marriage. There is some wiggle room because they're not brothers and closely related, but there's still this Redeemer idea still gets passed on to the next in line. Again, it's trying to keep the land within the family name. So yeah, the unnamed Redeemer does have some wiggle room to defend himself, saying, "Hey, he's not my brother. He's like second cousin or whatever the relation actually is." But there's still this responsibility as a redeemer that he should have been acting on because he's the next eligible one. He should have stepped up to the plate and been a redeemer. Well, he removes his sandal himself. That's so when the redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. So his sandal is removed by himself. Um, there's no record of her spitting in his face, so I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, so that's we're getting into questions 4 and 5 now. So 4, what reply did the unnamed kinsman redeemer give to Boaz? Buy it for yourself. 5, what action did he take to confirm the deal? He removed his own sandal. And I think that gets brought up. Maybe it doesn't get brought up. So there's there's one definite reason why the sandal thing happens, and the one from Deuteronomy about the sandal being pulled off as a mark of shame. That's maybe implied here as well. But it seems so this was the legal code to show that a land transfer had taken place, was removing your sandal and giving it to the other person. Hmm? Right. So it goes back to that. Right. Yeah, so Joshua, again, going to Joshua 1:3, every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. So there's this underlying idea that the land that you walk on is the land that God gives to you. And so then, as when that turns into when land transfers happen, it involves walking on the land itself. So when someone's transferring ownership of the land to another person, the seller would would grab the seller's foot and place it across the border onto their land to symbolically say, I am placing your foot on this land so that you may tread upon it and you may own it. And then that transforms into the symbolic placing their foot on the land by giving this sandal that has tread on the land that represents ownership of the land. I am now giving to you, and so that becomes the symbolic way to make the land transfer happen. And again, it's a physical event that's actually happening that the witnesses can see. So it's not just a case of he said, but it's also he said and then he handed over his sandal. So there's no discrepancy of did he really mean what he said, but he's handed over his sandal. That you don't accidentally take off your sandal and give it to somebody. There's intent there. So there's that recognition of the land transfer happening and the deal being made. Um, but yeah, does it also call back to this verse from Deuteronomy about if a brother fails to uphold his job as a redeemer, then the widow gets to pull off his sandal as a mark of shame and spit in his face? Maybe. Um, it's really easy to see a connection there, but again, he's not the brother. He's not as obligated to be the redeemer as a brother necessarily would have been. Am I still making sense? Okay.
So they're trying to settle this all peacefully.
Right. Yeah, that's why Boaz meets him at the city gate, because that's where business is conducted, because there's plenty of witnesses there to um, witness whatever dealings are made. That's why he calls the 10 elders aside to act as the judge, because that's the role of the elders in the city. They adjudicate over dealings and they act as witnesses. So if there's a discrepancy down the line, they can be like, no, I was there. I saw it. You gave him your sandal. Um, so Boaz is trying to do everything above board, legally, with witnesses, without lots of infighting, um, making sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. I should make a joke out of the Hebrew alphabet with that, but you guys probably wouldn't get it. And I can't think of it off the top of my head. I forget some of the names of the letters. Yeah. Well, I mean the dots. The dots are the vowels that get added into the alphabet later. Anyway, that there aren't any letters that inherently have a dot. Um, the what? Are you talking like tonality? I haven't heard anything about that. I don't know. I've never heard anyone say that Hebrew is a tonal language. I mean, they have if you look in the Hebrew scriptures, there's markings for. I have no idea what's going on with New Hebrew. I've only studied biblical Hebrew. Um, yeah, if you look in the Hebrew Old Testament, they'll have markings to indicate pitch for the sake of a cantor who's chanting them in a service. It's a rudimentary form of sheet music so that they know how to chant it, but that's not inherent to the language itself. That's if you're chanting it, this is the tone you'd use. Um, but yeah, if they're making Hebrew tonal like Mandarin is, where the way that your voice pitches changes what the meaning of a word is, I haven't heard anything about that. I have no idea. I don't. Okay, yeah, I have no idea what's going on with modern Hebrew. I don't pay attention to it. Yeah, um, yeah. All right. We'll go ahead and answer 6 because that's short, and then we'll call it because we're at time. So in 6, in today's society, lists some regulations that are involved with the transfer of property. signatures, witnesses, probably some kind of survey of the land to make sure that it's accurately represented. But again, the same sort of idea. Boaz is doing a legal transaction for the property here. He's got witnesses there. That's essentially the court of their day. He's brought up the responsibility of the redeemer. He makes sure everyone knows that the land has to be redeemed and it has to be one of these men because they're the next two in line to do it. But he's not, he doesn't like show up on the land with a bunch of men and be like, "Hey, unnamed redeemer, give me this land." He's doing everything in the right legal way. Does that make sense? I need to drink coffee before the service. All right, so we'll start next week on question 7 and continue on lesson 6. I forgot to print out the lesson 7 questions for you to look at ahead of time. I apologize, but I will have those ready by next week. So we'll continue on in lesson 6. So yeah, probably finish lesson 6 next week. Then we'll start lesson 7 next week. Excuse me, see if that takes 1 or 2 weeks to get through. We've been averaging 2 weeks on these. And then I'll figure something out, and then we'll start in the Augsburg Confession on the 11th. And I encourage you, and for you to encourage everyone else in the congregation to come to the Augsburg Confession study, because that's something really every Lutheran should know what it says, because that's the definition of what it is to be Lutheran. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm having lots of fun writing it. I encourage everyone to try to. I mean, you guys are the regulars. I'm preaching to the choir here, but when you go out in the fellowship hall, if you could like talk it up and encourage other people to come for it, I would appreciate it. That being said, I will pray us out, and then I will drink some coffee and then get ready for the service and hopefully stay awake for it. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the faithfulness of Boaz, that he was a worthy and righteous man, and that through his worthy and righteous actions we have this other model to better understand the worthy actions of your Son who redeemed us from sin, Satan, and death. We thank you for this opportunity to study your word and through it gain a deeper appreciation and understanding of what you have done and continue to do for us. We ask that you would be with us as we prepare to receive your gifts through the word and sacrament of the divine service, as we prepare to worship in your name, in which we pray. Amen.